Well, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 24, verses 36 through 44. But about that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away, so too will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two will be in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together, one will be taken and one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. Well, you might have noticed that we are in the Gospel of Matthew. We have spent so many months in Luke because here we mostly preach according to the lectionary, which is a common set of readings that's shared among many denominations. It's not mandatory that we follow it, but a lot of people do. And this is the first Sunday of Advent, Advent being the 4 Sundays before Christmas. And actually the 4 Sundays before Yes, it's 4 Sundays before Christmas. Sometimes that 4th Sunday falls on Christmas Eve, and when that happens, that day is actually 2 different days in the church calendar at once. It's the 4th Sunday of Advent in the morning, and then becomes Christmas Eve in the evening. But traditionally, Advent marks the start of the Christian calendar. So the Christian year begins with the first Sunday of Advent, and the way our readings are constructed is that it's on a 3-year cycle, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke are featured for most of that year in the cycle. So as it is the first Sunday of Advent and a new year, you'll be hearing a lot of Matthew, with a little bit of the Gospel of John interspersed in all 3 years, after we've been through a year of mostly Luke, and Luke. And so that's kind of how it works, and you work your way through the Gospels that way. So that's what's happening, but the first lesson every year, the way they arrange them is always interesting, because the very first lesson is always arranged so that the first lesson is about the second coming. So the first lesson doesn't start with the first chapter of the gospel. It actually starts with a lesson about the second coming. It begins at the end of the story. Now, we're not used to wanting the end of the story. For instance, I've had friends who are threatening life and limb if anyone who goes to see the new Star Wars movie on, on opening night happens to post on Facebook what happens. Okay? One of the great arguments is about how long you're allowed to give people before you can discuss what actually happens. Personally, I think it's about 2 weeks. I think if you haven't gone to see it in 2 weeks, you kind of deserve to know what happened. In fact, there was a pretty funny story this week. I don't know if you heard the story, but one of the actors, one of the leads in Star Wars, lost his script. He actually left it. He left it. A housekeeper found it, or somebody found it, and they put it on eBay. And fortunately, an employee of Disney saw it on eBay and bought it to be able to keep it from becoming public, and bought it for something insanely stupid like $85, okay, for a leaked copy of the Star Wars script. They bought it for like $85, and then they were able to turn it into the company, and I suspect that employee is getting a really nice Christmas bonus for having spotted that and found that. And they were even talking about how a lot of studios are so worried about endings leaking that they don't even give the actors complete scripts. So like most of the actors in the Avengers movies and stuff like that don't know how it ends. If you're not in the scenes where it ends, you don't get a copy of the script that includes the scene where it ends. And and sometimes the actors they may even go so far as to shoot multiple endings and not tell them how it is so it doesn't leak. So a lot of people hate knowing how the end is, but our story today is about the value of knowing how things end. Okay? It's about the need to understand how things end, and that's what Jesus is talking about. He's saying you can't really go through life without thinking about what's going to happen. He talks about the people in Noah's time, and he says, look, they were just living their lives. I mean, we know the story. We think about Noah, and we hear the story about all the evil in the world, and that's why the flood came. But here he doesn't even mention that. He says, look, they're just eating and drinking, marrying, giving. They're just having fun. They're just living their lives, and suddenly the flood comes, and whoosh, they were swept away. They knew nothing until the flood. They were living without thinking about the end. And that's something that Jesus wants us to think about. Now, that's actually been the subject of a number of movies and stuff like that, and age-old debates. I remember my friends and I in college debating the question, would you want to know when you were going to die? If you had the opportunity to know when the end was going to be for you, would you take it? Would you want to know? And I remember one of my friends saying, no, I really wouldn't. I wouldn't want to know when, because it would change the way I live. They would rather go through life not knowing. But actually, Jesus is kind of saying that maybe changing the way you live is a good thing. That maybe if you're thinking about the end and so it changes how you live, that would be good. He uses this analogy of a burglar coming in and breaking into a house, and he says, look, if you had known that that was going to happen, you would have stayed awake. If you had known that that was going to happen, then you would have changed what you did. You would have changed the way you lived if you had known what was going to happen in your life. So one of the questions really is, how is it that we are supposed to live differently? When we go into the story, when we enter the story knowing the end, and remember, when the Gospels were written, the end wasn't a surprise, okay? None of these Gospels are written before Jesus resurrected. I mean, the reason why the Christian movement began, the reason why the followers went out to spread the word, was because Easter happened. All right? So it's not like the gospel was this big surprise, this big revelation. They knew how it ended. It's just a story told to get you there, but they understood how it ended. And so the question really becomes, how is it that we are supposed to live differently by having the end in mind? Now, one of the things that people think about is when they think about having the end in mind, they often think about it being imminent. They often think about it being like tomorrow. You know, what would I do today if I knew that tomorrow was going to be my last day, or if I only had a week left? But that's not what Jesus is talking about, okay? So we need to remember that living with the end in mind is not the same as living as if there's no tomorrow. Okay, those are two different things. All right? Those are two different things, because we remember that when Jesus is talking about the end and talking about being ready for the end, let's remember it's 2,000 years later and it hasn't happened yet. Okay? It's 2,000 years later, and people who've been listening to Jesus and following the teachings have been trying to live for 2,000 years as if Jesus could be coming back at any moment, and he hasn't. Okay? So there is a value in living as if he could come back at any moment, even though he probably isn't coming back like tonight. We don't know that. Could be. Might be surprised. I'll be as surprised as anybody if it's tonight. Okay? But you don't know. But if you were a betting person, you'd have to say, probably not. And yet, we're supposed to live as if it could be. Live as if it could be coming. Live as if it could be next year. Live as if it could be within 5 years. All right? So what does it mean to do that? Because having the end in mind is not the same as believing there's no tomorrow. All right? But too many of us, in fact, do the opposite. Too many people, and we know this all the time, they live as if they're never going to end. They live as if the end is never going to happen. Okay? That they live as if they're going to be immortal. We talk that way about young people all the time, right? But I think old people do it too, okay? Lots of people never really deal with the fact that we're given a limited span of days. In fact, I know my parents weren't really ready in a lot of ways because what do a lot of our parents say? I don't want to talk about it. Okay? Why will a lot of people who need to hear that presentation next Sunday on wills and trusts not go? Because they don't want to think about it. All right? And so we have a lot of folks to do that, right? I know a lot of middle-aged people who say, if you talk to your parents about getting a power of attorney in case something happens, they go, I can't approach that subject with my parents because they don't want to talk about it. And I know even in my culture, my parents would have reacted to that by saying that even talking about it sounded like I was wishing them dead. It's like, no. Okay. I'm not wishing you dead. However, let's confront certain physiological realities, please. Okay? And so we have a hard time thinking about it, and so instead we choose to ignore it, and then we live without the end in mind. And then what happens is that we forget that remembering the end actually helps us live in the present. Remembering the end actually helps us live in the present for a simple reason, which is that living in the present is about living knowing what reality is. And that's so much of what we learn in faith. See, what we learn in faith is not about the unreal, but the real. All right? What we learn in faith is to look at the world the way it actually is. And the way it actually is that it is a world that is created by God who loves us. It is a world where God loves each and every one of us. It is a world where salvation is available to us and our existence does not end when our bodies end. Okay? These are all things that are true. And so to me, living without those truths in our lives is like trying to go through life without believing in gravity. All right? Faith is not about believing in that which is not true. It may be about believing in things that we can't scientifically prove, but it is about believing that there are truths that go beyond the things that are scientifically provable, and yet they are true. And so we live in accordance with that truth. And the truth that our existence in this life is limited should be a factor in how we live. Whenever we don't live our lives according to what's true, there's a problem. All right? So many things involve that. That's why if someone goes to a 12-step group, what's the first thing they do when they are introducing themselves? They talk about, hi, my name is, and then they say, I'm a, whatever it is, the addiction that they're battling. Why do they have to do that? Because in order to deal with their situation, they have to confront the truth of who they are. All right? Life just does not work when we don't deal in what is true. So remembering the end, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's something that we would rather not face, helps us live in the present because it helps us get in touch with what's actually true. And so he says, therefore, you also must be ready. You must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. So what does it mean to be ready for when Jesus returns, knowing that it's also probably not today, and it's probably not tomorrow, and it's probably not next Thursday, okay? And yet we are ready every single day. What does that mean? And I thought about that, and maybe you'll come up with a different answer from what I have, but for me, it means, I think, a certain desire to be satisfied each day with what I've done, with the time I've had. Okay? This is not to say that my life would be complete if it ended today. It would not be complete if it ended today. I have a lot of stuff I want to do tomorrow. Okay? laundry could go, but aside from that, that I will not miss, okay? I mean, if I die with a hamper full of clothes that didn't make it into the laundry, that's a win, okay? All right? But be satisfied with what you've done with the time you've had. Again, that's not saying that I don't have a really long list of things that I hope to do in the next 10 years, or the next 20 years, or the next 30 years, but did you do what you could? And what does it mean to live as one who is ready for the end, but not resigned to the end? See, you don't want to live as if, well, you ever see people like, well, we're all going to die, so it doesn't matter. I've met a person like that. It's called clinical depression, but I've met people like that. Okay? All right? And that's not what it means to live with the end in mind. It's to be ready for it, but not resigned to it. You're not just sitting there going, well, it doesn't matter, so I'm just going to... No. But ready for it. And ready for it isn't supposed to be something that we just measure in terms of what we do in a secular sense. Okay? Sure, some of it is. Some of the things that I want to do in the next 5 years, 10 years are related to work, are related to ministry, are related to these things. But a lot of being satisfied each day has to do with the things that are really more important, because we're always supposed to stay focused on what's more important, which is you don't want to face your end. You want to live each day knowing that when you go to bed at night, you said, I love you to the people you loved. Right? You want to go to bed at night, all right, having been as generous as you could have been that day. You want to go to bed at night having been as compassionate as you could have been up to that point in your life. Those are not things you want to leave on the table. Those are not things where you sit there and say, oh my gosh, I left so much good undone, so much love not shown. Okay? You don't want those things on the table. Other things, secular accomplishments, all right. But you don't want to forget that stuff. You want to deal with those things in the present. You want to have focused on what was important and focused on it for as long as you have to do so. When we do that, when we decide that that's the way we're going to live, then we're ready, you see, for the rest of the lessons in the year. So when we've decided that what we're going to do is we're going to live each day trying to maximize each day in terms of love, in terms of compassion, in terms of generosity, when we decide that that's how we're going to live, then the rest of the story can change the way we live. Because the rest of the story is Jesus expanding those definitions for us. See, it's one of the things that I always talk about when people say, I don't need religion. I don't need to go to church. I try to be a good person. Okay? And I understand that, and they're right. They're good-hearted people. They're trying to be a good person. Okay? But what Jesus always does for us is to understand that in a broader way. Okay? See, we always sit there and say, I try to be a good person. I've got this circle of friends and loved ones and people that I care about, and I'm good to, and I don't cheat them and all this kind of stuff. Right? And that's right. And then Jesus comes to us and he says, okay, that's great. Now draw the circle bigger. Oh, you were generous? That's great. Now try to be a little more generous. It's that continual challenge of being more, of doing more, of doing more for more that Jesus presents us with. And when we begin our year having made the decision that we're going to maximize the time we have in the service of what God would want, then we are ready to learn that the maximum is more than we thought we were capable of before. It's like any good trainer, right? Any good trainer gets you to do more than you thought you could, all right? That's why people use trainers, all right? It's not that they couldn't do the extra set if a trainer wasn't there. They could decide, I can do another set. But the trainer pushes them to say, nope, you think you're tired, but you can do more. You think 2 is enough, but you can do 3. And that's one of the things we gain from our faith, is to have that extra push, that extra nudge that says, yeah, you're trying to be a good person, and you can be better. You're trying to live up to your potential, but you haven't even seen how big your potential is. And when we try to live up to that every single day, then we're ready. Because whenever the end comes, we can say, I made the most of the time I had. Amen.